Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into like a real whodunit.
Yeah.
This is from the world of like late 16th century London theater.
Yeah.
And we've got like this fascinating puzzle,
Yeah.
that's built from some pretty great source material.
Yeah.
Primarily a YouTube deep dive, into these possible authors behind these four historical plays about, English Kings Edward the First, Second, Third, and Fourth.
Yeah.
And these plays, were staged and printed between 1593 and 1599.
Mm-hmm.
Really dynamic period for the London stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what like immediately grabs your attention is that you've got one of these. King Edward plays Edward II.
Right.
Clearly names Christopher Marlowe is the author, right?
Right.
But the other three, Edward III and Edward IV,
Yeah.
were initially published anonymously.
Yeah.
And it's this contrast that really is the heart of our investigation today.
Yeah, exactly. So the question that we're exploring for you today is this: could Christopher Marlowe have secretly written all four of these plays?
Right.
Could he have continued writing even after his reported death in 1593?
Right.
Using different names as cover?
Yeah.
It's a theory that, makes you look at these famous works and their creators in a whole new light.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start by digging into Edward I.
Okay, so the timeline around Edward I is sort of our first curveball, right?
Okay.
It was entered anonymously into the Stationer's Register in October of 1593.
Okay.
Now, the Stationer's Register was essentially the official record of published works at the time, so it's a bit like early copyright.
Right.
So for a play to be registered without an author's name so soon after Marlowe's supposed death raises immediate questions, right?
Right.
Then the first edition, the 1593 quarto, has this intriguing handwritten signature, George Peele, on the last page.
Okay.
So this has led many to suspect Peele as the author, but solid proof remains elusive.
Okay, but here's where it gets even more curious. This same 1593 quarto of Edward's First shares a rather specific detail.
Yeah.
With another notable publication from that year, Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. Both title pages featured the exact same woodcut emblem, the Anchor of Hope.
Oh, wow.
It's a fairly distinctive image to just pop up on two seemingly unrelated works. So you start to wonder, if there's a hidden connection there.
Right. Yeah, it gets even more layered because one particular printing of Edward I included an inlay card placed behind this Anchor of Hope emblem.
Okay.
And this image showed a male face resting on a skull, which itself was perched on what's described as a medieval Savonarola-style chair.
Wow.
It adds a really intriguing layer of potential symbolism, right?
Yeah.
Was this a deliberate secret message?
Right, and wouldn't you know it, the Anchor of Hope makes a reappearance.
Oh, really?
The very next year, in 1594, this emblem resurfaced, but this time it was noticeably altered.
Okay.
And where did it show up?
Where?
On both Shakespeare's Lucrece and an anonymous book called The Second Report of Dr. John Faustus. That Faustus link is hard to ignore given Marlowe's famous play about the character.
Exact. And here's a proposed interpretation that ties it all together.
Okay.
The theory suggests that the author, potentially Marlowe, using the Faustus connection as a subtle nod, was using this modified Anchor of Hope as a way to signal that he was still alive.
Okay.
And the Faustus report even mentions fulfilling the desire for novelties.
Right.
Could this be Marlowe hinting that his continued writing, including Edward I, was fulfilling that desire?
Right.
Even if under a veil of anonymity.
Right.
If that emblem had just appeared with the Faustus book, we might just see it solely within the context of that story's themes of life and death.
Right.
But its appearance alongside Edward I, so soon after Marlowe's supposed death, creates a much more suggestive picture.
Right.
It's almost like a secret authorial signature, hinting at a hidden continuity.
So we've got this intriguing web of anonymous publications, a shared and then modified emblem, and these potential hidden messages all swirling around Edward I.
Yeah.
Now let's pull back and look at the broader context.
Okay.
The fact that Edward III and Edward I were all initially published without an identified author really stands out against Edward II's clear attribution.
Yeah, this is a really critical point to consider.
Right.
If these plays were indeed written by four different individuals, Peele, Shakespeare, and Heywood for the anonymous ones, and Marlowe for Edward II.
Yeah.
Why the secrecy surrounding the majority of them?
Right.
It seems unusual that only Marlowe's name would be confidently attached to his work in this group.
And that leads us to the alternative, the theory we're really diving deep into.
Okay.
Could it be that the textual echoes and contextual similarities we observe across all four plays, combined with these strange historical and literary coincidences, all point to a single hand at the tiller?
Right.
Could that hand belong to Christopher Marlowe, continuing his remarkably productive career in secret after his supposed death?
And when you start to examine those textual parallels, the theory gains even more traction. The U2 analysis highlights some striking similarities between lines attributed to Peele and lines from Marlowe.
Okay.
For example, Peele wrote, "Hence feigned weeds unfeigned is my grief."
Okay.
While Marlowe penned, "Hence feigned weeds unfeigned are my woes."
Oh.
Or, "Consider Peele's makes their weapons wound the senseless winds." Alongside Marlowe's "Make your strokes to wound the senseless light."
Yeah.
These aren't just vague thematic overlaps.
Right.
The close phrasing and shared unusual vocabulary strongly suggest a single authorial hand at work across these seemingly disparate figures.
So now, why is Edward II the exception, being clearly attributed to Marlowe in 1594?
Well, the thinking here is that the play was likely staged and had become strongly associated with Marlowe in the public consciousness before his disappearance.
Okay.
The secret, if there ever was one, couldn't be kept. It was already out in the open.
Makes a lot of sense. And then you have the publication in that same year, 1594, of Piers Gaveston, His Life and Death.
Yeah.
This work contains strong autobiographical parallels to Marlowe's own life, yet it was published under the pseudonym Drayton. This clearly indicates a need for Marlowe to conceal his identity at this time.
Right.
Given that the educated elite in London likely knew about the rumor surrounding his death, what we might consider the fake news of the era, it would have been practically impossible for him to publish openly under his own name.
Right.
For all of these plays, anonymity or the use of pseudonyms would have been absolutely essential for him to continue working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's shift our focus now to Edward III.
Okay.
And its intriguing connection to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Initially, this play was excluded from the accepted body of Shakespeare's work.
Right.
It wasn't included in Francis Meres's 1598 list of Shakespeare's plays.
Right.
Or in the first folio of 1623. The reasons often given for this omission include potential objections to its less than flattering portrayal of the Scots.
Yeah. However, scholarly opinion has evolved significantly over time.
Okay.
Edward III is now widely accepted by many scholars as at least partially, and by some, entirely written by Shakespeare.
Right.
It's included in most major modern collections of his complete works.
Okay.
This reassessment largely came about through detailed stylistic and linguistic comparisons of the play's text with Shakespeare's known works, particularly his sonnets.
And when you compare them, the parallels really do jump out.
Yeah.
Take Sonnet 94, "Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds."
Okay.
That exact line appears in Edward III.
Wow.
Similarly, Sonnet 142 contains the line, "Those lips of thine that have profaned their scarlet ornaments," which echoes in Edward III as "his cheeks put on their scarlet ornaments."
Yeah.
Even a phrase like "her oriental red" from Sonnet 40 finds a resonance in the play with "their scarlet ornaments."
Oh.
These aren't just general similarities.
Right.
It's the specific vocabulary and unusual phrasing that make you think there's a much deeper connection than just influence.
Leading Shakespearean scholars have certainly weighed in on this.
Okay.
Gary Taylor, for instance, considered Edward III the strongest candidate among non-canonical works for inclusion in the Shakespeare canon.
Right.
And Eric Sams went even further, arguing that the play is entirely Shakespeare's.
Right.
So the evidence strongly suggests Shakespeare's involvement, at least in part.
Now let's turn our attention to Edward IV, which was published anonymously in 1599 and is generally attributed to Thomas Heywood.
Right.
This is where the observations of Professor Forza, highlighted in the YouTube analysis, become really important. He noted that Heywood extensively borrowed entire scenes in Edward IV Parts 1 and 2. From Shakespeare's earlier history plays, such as Henry VI Part 2 and Richard III. This established a clear link between Heywood and Shakespeare's work, suggesting Heywood was familiar with, and perhaps even adapting Shakespeare's earlier material. But the analysis points to a less obvious, yet potentially more revealing connection. Following Edward IV, Heywood penned 2 plays about Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. And he gave them the rather curious title, "If You Know Not Me, You Know Nobody."
Wow. Yeah, that title just begs for closer examination,
Right.
especially with that ambiguous use of nobody.
Right. And it becomes even more intriguing when you consider a similarly structured title from a few years later.
Okay.
Samuel Rowley's play from 1605, When You See Me, You Know Me, which interestingly was published by the same printer.
Yeah, exactly. Now, here's a possible interpretation for you to consider.
Okay.
These seemingly personal and somewhat cryptic titles could hold a hidden meaning.
Right.
That aligns perfectly with the Marlowe-Shakespeare authorship theory.
Okay.
Heywood's, not me, nobody could be read on one level
Yeah.
as Heywood asserting his own importance as a playwright.
Right.
If you don't recognize my work, you're missing out.
Right.
But if you entertain the idea that Heywood was a mask for Marlowe, right, the title takes on a double meaning. If you don't recognize me under this assumed name, then officially, as far as the world knows, I am nobody. I am considered dead.
And then Rowley's title, When You See Me, You Know Me, could be seen as a contrasting statement.
Yeah.
It suggests the author is still alive and recognizable, but perhaps in a situation where he needs to remain hidden.
Yeah.
Hence, you won't have the opportunity to see and thus truly know him publicly.
It's a fascinating way to interpret these titles, adding another layer to the overall puzzle.
Right.
Furthermore, scholars have noted connections between Rowley's play and the 1616b text of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus.
Okay.
Philip Henslow's diary even records payments made to Rowley for additions to Faust.
Wow.
This suggests Rowley could have been another pseudonym employed by Marlowe,
Right.
further complicating the landscape of authorship.
Right.
The extent of the revisions in that later Faustus edition has always been a bit of an enigma for traditional Shakespearean scholarship.
And this theme of nobody doesn't just appear in play titles.
Right.
The analysis highlights a significant trend in contemporary literary dedications.
Okay.
Around the turn of the 17th century, various authors frequently used nobody and somebody in their dedications of plays and poems.
Yeah.
This widespread usage hints at a shared understanding or perhaps even an inside joke circulating within literary circles, possibly related to the practice of concealed identities.
John Davies's epigrams from his 1610 work, The Scourge of Folly, provide perhaps some of the most direct and compelling clues.
Okay.
Epigram 159 compares the hyphenated Shakespeare to the Roman playwright Terence.
Okay.
Praising his reigning wit, but then pointedly noting that what he sows, others are reaping.
Right.
The interpretation here is that this Shakespeare, possibly a hyphenated reference linking Marlowe and Shakespeare, isn't fully benefiting from his own genius. Others like Peele and Heywood are gaining recognition from his work, published under their names or anonymously.
And then we have the really striking Epigram 160, which directly connects the English Terence Shakespeare to his most unknown first identity, nobody. Assuring him of protection with the line, "You shall be served with naught." The analysis argues that this strongly implies that Shakespeare was a pen name, a second public identity for the concealed nobody, who was, in reality, Marlowe. Remaining nobody was the best way to stay safe and continue his writing.
The anonymous play Nobody, and somebody from 1606, further reinforces this idea.
Okay.
It seems to contain autobiographical elements with the character Nobody. Lamenting his lack of personal recognition despite his fame being preserved under other names. The line about being half-hanged because you have an ill name is particularly powerful. It suggests that Marlowe's official death had essentially extinguished his public identity, making him a non-person, even though his creative output continued to flourish under different guises.
And we can't overlook News from Gravesend from 1604. Now, while traditional scholarship like that of Gary Taylor has attributed this work to Dekker and Middleton, the YouTube analysis puts forward the idea that it could be another pseudonym for Marlowe. The dedication of the piece is to nobody. And the author characterizes himself as a highly prolific yet underappreciated writer. A description that certainly fits the profile of a secretly writing Marlowe.
The significance of Gravesend itself is also quite suggestive. It was geographically Marlowe's last known location, situated between London and his family home in Canterbury. It also connects to the periods when the London theaters were closed due to the plague. A time of disruption and potential shifts in theatrical practices. Even the allusions within the text to popular works like The Merry Tales of the Cobbler of Canterbury and The Tinkerer of Turvey could be subtle personal nods to Marlowe's background and current circumstances.
The sheer volume of literary work that the Marlowe-Shakespeare thesis implies is certainly a point to consider. However, the analysis addresses this by quoting a line from news from Gravesend itself, where the anonymous author rather confidently states that one London occupier, potentially Marlowe, produces more in a single week than 7 Bachelor of Arts could manage in an entire year.
Wow.
It's a bold claim, but it underscores the immense literary talent that proponents of this theory attribute to the hidden playwright.
And finally, the epilogue of news from Gravesend, spoken by the character Nobody, offers a witty commentary on the lack of reward for good service.
Okay.
The logical argument presented that criticizing nobody is nonsensical because nobody can be offended.
Right.
Cleverly reinforces the theme of a concealed identity and the potential dangers of acknowledging it publicly.
So when you piece it all together, we have this compelling, albeit unconventional argument.
Right.
The initial anonymity of Edward III and the singular attribution of Edward II, the shared and evolving anchor of hope emblem, the textual parallels across the plays and with Shakespeare's sonnets, and this recurring motif of nobody and somebody woven throughout the literature of the period.
Right.
It all creates a fascinating narrative,
Yeah.
suggesting that Christopher Marlowe may have continued his career as a playwright in secret, using various pseudonyms for years after he was supposedly killed.
What's truly fascinating here is the interconnectedness of these seemingly disparate pieces of evidence.
Right.
The aha moment for you, the listener, comes when you realize that these anomalies in authorship and these textual echoes might not be random coincidences,
Right.
but rather deliberate pieces of a larger, intentionally concealed puzzle.
Yes.
It really forces a reevaluation of how we understand the literary world of Elizabethan England and the creative output of its most celebrated figures.
And for you, our listener, what does this alternative perspective spark in your mind?
Yeah.
Does it ignite a new curiosity about the established stories surrounding Shakespeare and his contemporaries?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's really interesting to think about, the possibility that there are these sort of hidden figures or hidden hands behind some of these works.
Right.
And authorship was a very different concept back then.
Right.
And the idea of collaboration and, using pseudonyms and things like that was much more common than we might think today.
Right.
So it's really interesting to sort of, peel back those layers.
Yeah, and maybe rethink some of those assumptions that we had for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a good reminder that history is always being rewritten.
Right.
And new evidence comes to light and new perspectives emerge.
Right.
And we have to be open to sort of reevaluating the stories that we tell ourselves about the past.
Could the accepted narratives have more intriguing secrets hidden within them than we've previously imagined?
I think that's a great question and one that I think is worth exploring further. I mean, I think this deep dive has really just scratched the surface of this whole question of authorship and the sort of mysteries that surround these Elizabethan playwrights.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a lot more to uncover here.
This deep dive raises a really significant question that extends far beyond just these 4 plays. If the traditional understanding of Shakespearean authorship has such compelling alternative interpretations, what other long-held assumptions about history, about the nature of creativity, and about the stories we tell ourselves might also be ripe for a fresh and critical re-examination?
I think that's the big takeaway here, right? I mean, if we can question something as fundamental as who wrote Shakespeare's plays, then really anything is up for grabs. And I think that's both exciting and a little bit unsettling. But it's definitely something that we should be thinking about,
Yeah, it's a great thought to keep with us long after our discussion concludes.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.